Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 53 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, we are spending this series, or at least as many weeks of it as I can muster, on Humphrey Carpenter's excellent book, The Inklings. Eventually, we are going to get back to the revised and expanded letters next series, but today I'm going to Carpenter's book to look at some of the differences between the Inklings. Now, last week we looked at the idea of Tolkien, Lewis, Williams, and Barfield as supposedly the Oxford Christians, and saw how that notion fell apart when we looked more closely, or even superficially to be honest, at their theological differences. But let's take a look at some more from Carpenter's chapter, A Fox That Isn't There. In questioning the notion of there being a common academic viewpoint shared by the men, Carpenter starts by acknowledging the general similarity. They are, after all experts in English literature, before he points out that within this field, their forms of expertise could scarcely have been more different. How different? Well, let's start with Tolkien. He was a specialist in Old English, think Beowulf, as well as Middle English, think Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, along with, of course, the related Germanic languages like Icelandic. Then there's his approach to literature, which Carpenter describes as, quote, primarily through philology. His academic work was distinguished by great insight, and there was nothing remotely pedantic about it, but it was nonetheless work of great precision and accuracy, involving a detailed study of the minutiae of early literature. And that full thing right there was the quote from Humphrey Carpenter. Now, contrast this with Lewis, who, although he was interested in these older languages, remember earlier on when we were going through this book, we learned that he joined the Coal-Biters to listen to Old Icelandic. The fact is that Lewis had primarily studied more recent literature, and he was far from precise. As Carpenter says of Lewis, quote, there was nothing of the precise textual scholar about him. Lord bless you, he once told a former pupil, I can't edit any more than I can audit. I'm not accurate. He was not. Though he quoted fluently, it was often inaccurately. End quote. I love that. Dear reader, he was not. Then we have Williams. Now, it would seem on the surface, at least, that Williams would share something in common with Lewis here, though not necessarily with Tolkien. And Carpenter does mention one. He says that Williams's Milton lectures at Oxford were the germ of Lewis's preface to Paradise Lost. But beyond that, there wasn't a lot in common between them academically either. Carpenter writes, quote, Lewis liked to maintain that literature is ultimately no more than a recreation, though a very valuable one. He declared that the salvation of a single soul is more important than the production or preservation of all the epics and tragedies in the world, end quote. But to Williams, as Carpenter writes, great poetry was a thing of supreme importance, essential to a full spiritual life, and indeed itself a source of supernatural power. And then he quotes Williams, love and poetry are powers, he declared through the mouth of Roger Ingram in Shadows of Ecstasy. Elsewhere in the same novel, Ingram declares that Milton's verse is a form of immortal energy. This is definitely different from Lewis's views. Now, interestingly, though Carpenter did look at Barfield's theological beliefs in this chapter, he doesn't discuss Barfield's academic take here at all. And honestly, I don't know enough about him to discuss that without a foundation. So I'm going to move on instead to the next bit that Carpenter talks about. We're going to move on from the academic similarities or differences to myth and mythology. Obviously, all three writers produce stories where myth is important, if not absolutely vital. But as Carpenter points out, they each use myth in very different ways. Williams, Carpenter argues, quote, takes the already existing Arthurian myth and uses it as a setting for metaphysical odes. On the other hand, Lewis uses the Christian myth and reclothes it for his didactic purposes. Tolkien, Carpenter says, invents his own mythology and draws stories of many different kinds from it, end quote. Now, he does acknowledge the shared belief for Tolkien and Lewis that myth is capable of portraying truth. And that's the concept that we find expressed perfectly in Tolkien's poem Mythopoeia. Definitely something I want to look at here on a Today's Tolkien Tuesday, or maybe, that would be a Today's Tolkien Tuesday for sure. So we'll probably look at Mythopoeia at some other point. Now, what other area can we look for similarities between these guys? Carpenter looks next at an interesting one, magic and the occult. Now, okay, as mainly a Tolkien guy myself, I'm already a little skeptical, but why not? Carpenter acknowledges there are artifacts in Tolkien's legendarium that are objects of great power. Silmarils and the One Ring come to mind. But then Carpenter rightly points out that, quote, the story of Frodo Baggins carrying it to Mordor is a story more of natural than of supernatural events, a tale of courage and heroism and treachery, rather than of actual magic. Of course, on the other hand, you have Charles Williams, whose stories are infused with magic and the occult. As Carpenter explains, quote, the crucial events in his stories occur in the plane of the supernatural, while the terminology of magic and occult practices is part of Williams' basic vocabulary. He and Tolkien had nothing whatever in common in the way they used the supernatural in their stories. Now, Lewis, Carpenter explains, had become fascinated with the occult back in his school days, and his interest got revived when he discovered Yeats's poetry. Still, he was also wary of it. Carpenter writes, partially quoting Lewis himself, when he met Yeats at Oxford in 1921, he was half fascinated and half repelled, and finally the more repelled because of the fascination, end quote. Now, once Lewis had converted to Christianity, he strongly rejected anything that was even vaguely occult. Interestingly, though, Carpenter points to the final book in Lewis's space trilogy, That Hideous Strength. I haven't read those books in far too long, Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength. Now, in that story, Merlin, who Carpenter argues was based on Lewis's memories of Yeats, engineers the downfall of the villains by supernatural means, but Lewis never indulged in the kind of occultism that attracted Williams, believing that a passion for such things is, as he put it, a spiritual lust, end quote. Now, Barfield does get a brief mention here, as Carpenter points out that while the word occult occurs in Barfield's writing, Barfield himself was quick to emphasize that in this context, the word merely means hidden and has nothing to do with magic or witchcraft. As Carpenter says at this point in the book, we are being driven to look for the fox in some rather unlikely places. And we will try to continue that search next week. For now, though, this wraps up this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Be sure to join me again next week for more on the Inklings. In the meantime, please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can join the Content Council and be a part of deciding what I talk about. You also can support the show, get an ad-free feed, and a bonus episode every week. Join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.